Soviet Psychiatric Extermination Islands Gas Chambers of the 20th Century. From the author. Although the USSR officially no longer exists, I am still underground. There are no fictional persons, names, surnames, or initials in this book. I have only disguised them where necessary. Fulfilling my duty to my conscience and therefore to myself, and to my grandmother, who replaced my mother and saved my life and honor from the hands of psychiatric executioners, while at the same time fulfilling my duty to my conscience and bowing before the murdered and living victims of psychiatry, whose inconsolable souls call me to vengeance, I wrote this book. For reasons of safety, as well as personal moral reasons and life circumstances, I have taken this particular surname and name, intending in the future, at the first opportunity, to bear them officially. Grandfather Frost brought us gifts. Madhouses, prisons, camps, and American-made handcuffs to decorate our Christmas trees. When you enter a madhouse, psychiatric hospital, or psychiatric dispensary, you are no longer a human being, not even a slave, not even an object. For the Soviet authorities, from that moment on, you are nothing. You do not even possess the rights that a Soviet slave has. And they make this clear to you immediately, as soon as you fall into the hands of your executioners. And if you have no relatives who could save you, no hope of escape, if you cannot fight and die in a final battle for freedom and honor, thank fate if they kill you immediately, without torture, without torment. Otherwise, it is impossible even to imagine what may happen to you. For there are no words in the human language capable of describing everything that can happen to you. I remember how one bitch walked down the corridor of the madhouse with sanitary guards, with her two-tier-wheeled ward table, usually pushed by two psychiatric prisoners, going from one room of prisoners to another, cynically called wards, spreading death and torture. Her appearance in the wards was a harbinger of our death. By the right of the strong, by the right of the Soviet Union, with threats, beatings by orderlies, and physical abuse in which she personally participated with the greatest pleasure, she forced us to drink deadly poison. Sometimes the orderlies did not wait for orders and beat and maimed us on their own initiative. If you think about it, it turns out they forced us, with our own hands, to drink this poison and thus kill ourselves. Usually they made us drink several types of poison at once, often mixing all the powder together and, using paper, forcibly pouring it into our mouths. First of all, this was done to political victims. When, in her opinion, the poison did not act quickly enough, she would, with fury and hatred, force us to take double and triple doses. Once, when they had just begun poisoning me, out of hatred and contempt I pretended that the poison had no effect on me, although I could barely stand on my feet. She noticed my contempt and made me drink such an amount of poison that it was difficult to swallow at once. She could not stand healthy people. This drove her into a rage. Her hatred toward us brought her almost to hysteria. Each time, inventing new false accusations, she continued to torment us. She calmed down only slightly when she personally poured various powders into our mouths with her own hands. She treated others she hated for different reasons in the same way. After that, she would usually shout the order: "Forward! For Stalin! For the motherland!" I still remember her deadly, vile, hatred-filled, sadistic voice. "Open your mouth, show me, take it. Did you drink? Open your mouth wider, I'm telling you. Drink for Stalin. I think that's not enough for you. Open your mouth, show me, take it, take it. Forward. For Stalin." And this was what they called administering medicine. In the science of psychiatry, what is right and what is wrong is decided by Marx. Treatment is prescribed in the name of Marx and Engels. Reading psychiatric studies and experiments, I noticed that conclusions are drawn by proving their correctness through quotations from Marx, Engels, and sometimes Lenin. In particular, it turns out that Marx, in addition to his other professions, is also the founder of Soviet psychiatry, the first Soviet psychiatrist and psychologist for all kinds of executioners and peoples. Thus, Marx becomes the greatest psychiatrist and psychologist of all times and nations, just as Stalin becomes a great botanist, physicist, and so on. In other words, according to the prescriptions of Marx, Engels, and other genius leaders, one can and must treat the mentally ill. In general, psychiatry as an exact science does not exist. No one has the right to speak or decide in the name of a science which, in practice, does not yet exist as an exact science. Otherwise, it is charlatanism. The consequence: ruined lives, crimes, death. Any honest psychiatrist may attempt to heal a patient's soul without harming the body or violating freedom, and not rely on ideology or the laws of whatever country they may be in. Not to mention the treatment of completely healthy people. In the USSR, for purposes of agitation and propaganda, they often like to show and talk about doctors of Nazi Germany conducting experiments on prisoners. Look at these monsters, murderers, fascists. But many do not know that in the Soviet Union, experiments were also conducted on people in psychiatric hospitals. Personally, 3 or 4 times I became a candidate for experiments, someone who, if approved, would be used for testing. The selection of candidates took place like in slave markets. Usually, under escort, a patient is brought and handed over to doctors. Besides your regular doctor, another sits there, a buyer doctor. If the patient is aggressive, one of the orderlies remains. Then begins an interrogation about your health, but this is merely a pretense, since your doctor already knows everything about you. Therefore, an experienced psychiatric prisoner expects nothing good from such a visit. After some time, when your case becomes clear, the buyer doctor joins the questioning, and together, in your presence, they discuss whether the given commodity is of interest for experiments or not. There are other forms as well. I remember how Asiya Bogdanovna, the doctor of our ward, and our bitch, Marietta Albertovna Melik-Pashayan, walked through the madhouse with their guests, selecting new victims for them. I remember it was a sunny day, but inside me there was cold and fear. They looked at us, listening to the professor speak about our cases and testing the merchandise. The professor was in high spirits, although she looked with hatred at those of us who were unsuitable for experiments, grew irritated, and did not hide her anger. That day, my candidacy was examined twice. Unlike others, they even tested me with a foot. It happened like this. Hoping to avoid becoming experimental material, I hid in a foreign ward one they had already visited, taking advantage of the absence of orderlies in the corridor. But they found me anyway and began interrogating me. Among the guests, one particularly insolent woman stood out. She approached me, climbed backward onto a white hospital cabinet so that she was directly above me, just centimeters from my face, and suddenly began showing me her leg. Then, just as suddenly, she began swinging her leg back and forth many times. The fool had clearly been reading Freud. I was tense all over, but I did not show it. I only wondered why she was doing this. Most of all, I feared a sudden kick to the face. A feeling of humiliation choked me. I sat with my head lowered and thought, why isn't she wearing the uniform of a Soviet SS officer? And yet they live in this world, and no state declares them criminals against humanity, no one demands their execution. By this, the states of planet Earth demonstrate their grotesque political morality. By proving their immorality, their morality proclaims that the victors are not judged. The psychology of Soviet leaders, shouting to the whole world that they are the greatest, reveals itself not only there but also in psychiatry, where they consider themselves the greatest and the only correct psychiatrists in the world. I myself heard this in conversations between our professor and her guests. In reality, they are primitive to the point of absurdity. Take, for example, the fact that any person can pretend to be mentally ill, if their nerves hold out, which in itself speaks to the quality of psychiatry. To torment and torture that they are indeed taught very well. In this, they are truly the greatest among the great in world psychiatry. Among the mentally ill there are patients who have nothing to do with psychiatry at all, such as those suffering from asthma, rheumatism, and other conditions that are not mental illnesses. This is a country of death and suffering, a country of helplessness, despair, and madness. In psychiatry, there are so-called medical conversations, but in reality, these are medical interrogations, a bitter and senseless thing, and from the point of view of treatment, pure idiocy, a mockery of psychiatric political prisoners and others. It begins with you being brought under escort to a doctor, who nods toward a chair. "Sit," he says, studying your case file. Then he looks up, assumes an appropriate expression, and not in an interrogative tone asks, "Do you have thoughts, thoughts? Bastard, who doesn't have thoughts? Does a normal person not have thoughts? Does an abnormal person, in the physical sense, not have thoughts? Only the brain of a dead person has no thoughts." But restraining himself, the victim usually answers, "No." When they put me in the madhouse for the second time, at this question I even shook my head while answering negatively. "Do you see anything, anything?" Usually, victims answer no to this question, although in reality it is known that only a blind person sees nothing regardless of whether he is mentally ill or not. "Do you hear voices, voices?" If one is not deaf, then yes, one hears. But for some reason, we answer, no. "Do you have enemies, enemies?" What an idiot, I thought. One of them is you. I would tear you to pieces if I had the chance. Officially, however, we answer, no. Then they take you to other doctors who ask similar questions. But all these questions in different forms and content are also traps, because if needed, your answers can be altered, interpreted in such a way that you are declared mentally ill. There is also something else, the illiteracy of doctors, their self-admiration, crude self-confidence, indifference, and hatred toward both the sick and the healthy. I remember a cleaning woman at the madhouse, well familiar with the system, saying, "If you want them to declare you sick, answer all questions incorrectly. It is enough to confuse a few things, and you are already considered mentally ill." For example, they ask, "What is 3 plus 5, or 7 minus 4? And in another office, some brute, feigning indifference, may ask, "Do you work? And why is your finger yellow?" This is already a double trap. On one hand, you can say that you smoke and your finger has turned yellow from cigarette smoke. Many answer this way. On the other hand, if a person does not know the reason or has never thought about it, he still becomes a candidate for a ruined life. This raises a question: why don't people try to prove that they are not insane? Of course, one can answer this logically, but what benefit does it bring if a person has already been sentenced in advance? Moreover, driven by caution, people give short answers during interrogations. This is fear, which lives in each of us, both in the healthy and in those who are not mentally ill but suffer from nervous or physical illnesses, such as epilepsy. Not everyone has a broad scientific outlook that would allow them to express themselves elegantly. And even those who possess such qualities sometimes cannot respond due to fear. The psychological pressure inside a person grows the longer he remains in the madhouse. In other words, psychological pressure gradually accumulates despair in the soul. A person may be a scientist, an academic, a linguist, a literary scholar, yet still find it difficult to speak. Especially under such deadly circumstances as being confined in a madhouse. The endless, unceasing psychological atmosphere oppresses and destroys a person. In addition, before being taken to a doctor for interrogation, prisoners are usually already poisoned with medications, leaving them exhausted and oppressed. And it is well known, a tired, exhausted brain, and therefore the person answers all questions briefly in such a state. This is done especially with political prisoners in psychiatry, for obvious reasons. I remember during one interrogation, when I was being questioned, alongside my so-called attending physician there was also a buyer doctor, who had come to acquire a specimen for experiments in this case, me. My doctor formally questioned me about my case, and when I proved that I was not ill, the buyer doctor asked, If you are so intelligent, then why are you here? What are you doing here? I don't understand. Why are you here? I remember once, at the military enlistment office, one woman didn't even speak to me. She simply declared that I was insane, without even bothering to familiarize herself with my so-called case file. Years later, another woman declared that I was not ill, that she knew me well despite the fact that I had never seen her in my life. She had never been my doctor, just like the previous one. The wind of death was blowing from the KGB and I knew it. The staff of madhouses stop at nothing. Once, I witnessed how a seriously ill patient, V, who had become gravely sick due to an incident in the army, was mocked and provoked into attacking other severely ill patients. In another case, I saw a seriously ill patient, G, being forced to dance. One of the orderlies stood out, in particular orderly, S. And this was repeated every day in different ways. Beatings are also a common occurrence, especially for dissenters. I noticed that beatings gave the orderlies endless pleasure. During the beatings, their faces lit up with satisfaction, and when they finished, an even greater sense of gratification appeared on their faces. And reasons for beatings are always found. For example, they beat you for a hesitant answer, for your tone of voice, for refusing to take medicine, which slowly or quickly destroys the body and brain, leaving only a shell of a human being, gradually killing him, for speaking, when an orderly is in a bad mood, or simply for no reason at all. As the saying goes, if there's a person, a case will be found. There was no peace even at night, especially in the evenings. The orderlies drank vodka, which they forced relatives of the victims to supply. The mechanism was simple. Through threats and blackmail or by hinting that you would be treated better, they made it clear what was expected. Usually, in addition to patients and political prisoners, madhouses also contain criminal offenders, especially those who have committed serious crimes and are avoiding trial and punishment. This is not only characteristic of such places but also of ordinary hospitals, for example, the Abovian Tuberculosis Hospital. Naturally, large bribes are paid to place them there, but in psychiatric hospitals, the bribes are incomparably higher, since the crimes committed are often particularly serious. Sometimes even KGB personnel themselves end up in psychiatric hospitals for saying a few words of truth. I remember one such man being brought in. He was in a state close to fainting. I remember how, in a pitiful voice, he said to the orderlies, "I know. I have read about what they do to people in places like this. Drug use in madhouses is also common among criminal elements. Drugs, like vodka, were supplied through the same channels. I remember once they brought in a young man who, with his dump truck, had broken through barbed wire in an attempt to escape to Turkey. Border guards shot at his truck, aiming at the wheels. The truck overturned, and the young man was beaten, kicked with boots, his ribs damaged so badly that he could barely breathe. Then one of the officers intimidated him, saying that prison or labor camps were even worse than the madhouse. Pretending compassion, that scoundrel sent the young man to a psychiatric hospital. Those psychiatric political prisoners who are known in the free world in the West may still hope for rescue. But what about those whom no one knows about, not even within the Soviet Union? An unknown fugitive is arrested and thrown into a madhouse. What hope can an unknown dissenter have? And it is precisely these unknown political prisoners who form the majority and who perish in psychiatric hospitals in obscurity. Naturally, a dictatorial regime, by its very ideology, conceals this. It is known, though only to a few, that today those who believed in perestroika and glasnost, who opened their hearts, find themselves there on the psychiatric islands. Now our executioners call them by a new word, perestroika supporters. If one reflects on this mockery, certain conclusions can be drawn about the reality of life and the morality of Stalinist communists. Psychiatry is not limited to physical, biological, and biophysical torture, torment, and murder. They also employ psychological torture, torment, and killing. When a person is brought here, the first thing they try to do is break his will, dignity, and honor. This begins from the very moment of arrest, when with the arrogance, insolence, and cynicism characteristic of Soviet fascism they attack a person, violating his inviolability and his feelings with their inhuman manners. Unlike prisons, camps, and places of exile, on these islands people are separated from the world psychologically as well. An island may be located even in the center of a city, yet people may not know who its inhabitants really are. Passers-by walk past and, at best, think, madmen. In some historical periods, when a person was imprisoned, sent to a camp, or exiled, he knew that when his term ended, he would be released. But here, a psychiatric prisoner is deprived of that right. He does not know how long he will be held, whether he will ever regain freedom, or whether he will remain in the madhouse forever. There are people who have been confined for decades and continue to remain there if they do not perish. In madhouses, there are no terms. Before Brezhnev died, and in the years leading up to it, these psychological methods began to spread into prisons, camps, and exile settlements. These methods of sadism existed earlier as well, but in somewhat different forms. During the times of Brezhnev, Andropov, and Chernenko, these methods were only refined, modernized, as they would say. Previously, after serving a sentence, a person would be released from prison, camp, or exile, and then shortly afterward, for example, the next day he would be arrested again and given a new sentence. In the later years of Brezhnev's life, this changed. In prisons, camps, and exile locations, directly within the zone before the sentence expired, or even well in advance, a new case would be fabricated against a person, and a new sentence would be imposed right there. When we approached a doctor in those rare moments when he appeared in the corridor of the madhouse, our purpose was always the same, to find a way out, to be released. But he would not look at the person addressing him. He pretended not to hear. Usually, he would look above us, somewhere off to the side or at the ceiling, behaving as if the person speaking to him simply did not exist. As far as I remember, all doctors behaved this way. It is terrifying, suffocating, painful to remain in a madhouse. There are no words and cannot be any to express this feeling. And if a person remains there, they kill him through indescribable torment, or through various means they interfere with the functioning of his brain, until eventually he loses his mind and then dies without even realizing that he is dying. No one wishes to die such a death. The expectation that you will perish in such a manner is itself an unbearable torture. All these psychological and psychiatric tortures create a state with no way out. The very prospect of going insane is itself deadly. The mere fact of being in a madhouse already destroys a person. There is also another psychological method: the presence of criminal elements within psychiatric hospitals. It is known that there are criminals sentenced to death, but in some cases the sentence is not carried out. Instead, they are kept on these psychiatric islands as orderlies. For such roles, they usually select the most extreme sadists, people who have no right to live, just like the ideology of the authorities that created all of this. But besides these official criminals, there are also so-called ordinary ones, whose sadism is no different. They often pretend to be mentally ill in order to avoid trial and punishment. There is nothing higher in human life than freedom, conscience, and honor. If all the victims were united and in solidarity, they would fight for this. But the authorities of these psychiatric islands have accounted for that as well. The main measure against rebellion among dissenters is to keep political prisoners in small groups, for example, in the same hospital but in different departments according to the principle, divide and rule. Unfortunately, for a single individual to break the vile heads of the executioners and attempt escape is almost impossible for a number of reasons. One of these reasons is torture and torment. In such a condition, it is difficult for a person to escape. When even this last hope fades, a person is left with one final means: suicide. Each individual fact, not to mention all of them together, places a person in an unbearable, hopeless position, thereby driving people to commit suicide. This is precisely what constitutes psychological murder. By creating such conditions, they count on the victims to kill themselves with their own hands. Psychiatry also has other aims, for example, to force a person to renounce his beliefs. One purpose of this is to use a person as a means of intimidation. Killing with a towel is also a common practice in psychiatry. The technique is as follows: usually at night, while the victim is asleep, 3 killers enter the ward. One sits on the legs of the sleeping person, who naturally tries to get up. At that moment, the others throw a towel around his neck from behind and strangle him. I remember how they brought in one healthy man. According to him, a false case had been fabricated, an attempted hijacking of an airplane, or rather, the intention to literally steal one. He had been transferred from the Soviet Psychiatric hospital. He could barely speak, from trembling, but he said that there, unlike in our madhouse, they strangled 2 or even 3 people per night. Criminals and sadists carried this out, but for me, this was no longer new. I had known about this method since the first time I was brought to the island of death. Soviet psychiatry is a hospital of torment, suffering, and death. And if a person ends up here, under certain circumstances he may already consider himself dead. Let us take a walnut as an example. If it is empty, eaten from the inside by a worm, this is almost invisible from the outside. That is exactly how victims of psychiatry are killed. They do this with injections and medications that wear a person down, dismantling him from within. This happens over the course of several days or even sooner, depending on the intensity of the treatment. Using myself as an example, I can say that there were 2 occasions when I nearly died from this so-called treatment. As a result, I completely lost my physical health, especially the condition of my heart. It is hanging by a thread. My years, like those of many victims of psychiatry, are apparently numbered. Already at the beginning of exposure, these medications kill a person from within, disrupt the functioning of internal organs, for example, the pancreas, reproductive organs, tiny microscopic blood vessels, not to mention larger ones, the liver, bodily sensitivity, and much more. How could one list it all? In the case of the use of sulfur, the victim's blood pressure rises monstrously, causing internal hemorrhaging in the brain, and the person dies. The same happens with the heart. Blood vessels rupture due to extreme pressure. In addition to its biophysical effects, sulfur also affects mental processes, interfering with thinking and reasoning. Its effects are not limited in time, as it has a hidden, latent impact on the human body, laying the foundation for future illnesses that previously did not exist. Even a minor trigger can lead to new diseases that may seem unrelated to sulfur. This happens because, although the initial effects gradually subside after the torture, certain irreversible consequences remain: damage inflicted on the body during the torment caused by sulfur. Only a tiny margin of pressure separated me from death. Lying on the brink of death, I wondered what would kill me first: a ruptured heart or burst blood vessels in the brain. Sometimes I thought both would happen at once. So-called sulfur, sometime after injection, raises the body temperature above 42 degrees Celsius. It is clear that this also kills. And in cases of deliberate improper handling, for example, failure to observe the correct temperature standards of the injected substance, the suffering intensifies, leading to death. But there is yet another form of torment, one that kills through even greater suffering. It begins with several days of forcing or pouring into a person's mouth substances like Belladol, haloperidol, and other so-called medications, in large doses. Each of these substances performs its executioner's role. One destroys glandular function, damages the liver, gallbladder, mucous membranes, and reproductive organs. The elasticity and sensitivity of the skin, muscles, and entire body are lost. Another interferes with brain function, reducing a person to an idiotic state, affecting breathing, creating artificial asthma, the heart, and the biological system of the body. A person ages by decades almost immediately. It begins with the eyes. The eyelids almost completely close, reducing the ability to see. To see at all, one must turn the head directly toward the object. The tongue swells and no longer fits in the mouth. A person becomes hunched, leaning forward, and the gait changes. And after several days, something begins that cannot be described in words. It begins suddenly. Suddenly, you feel that all your muscles begin to stretch in incomprehensible ways in length and in width, in every direction. Pain appears and intensifies, gradually seizing the entire body. A person is seized with horror at these incomprehensible sensations. To somehow avoid the pain, one tries not to move. But this is impossible. The stretching and contracting of the muscles, as well as the pain, continue constantly, regardless of your will. In turn, attempts not to move result in even more pain. New movements and new pain are added. And so it continues endlessly, without interruption. Since a person cannot remain still or move freely, he alternates between trying to move and trying not to move continuously because the pain and muscular distortions are constant. Then suddenly everything reaches a new level, a new peak. At the same time, your legs, thighs, everything begin to pull and contract on their own, independently of one another, each tendon and muscle acting separately. They stretch and contract as if they no longer belong to you. This creates hellish pain, suffering, and terror. At the same time, other parts of the body become involved. The muscles and tendons of the shoulders begin to vibrate. The shoulder muscles twitch and contract, causing pain that merges with all the other pain. Within minutes, the muscles of the abdomen, back, and all internal organs also become involved. Everything, independently of one another and independent of the person, begins to perform meaningless movements, contracting, twitching, pulling, creating ever new waves of pain. For the human mind, for the brain, and for the body, this is incomprehensible and unacceptable, because there is no logic in it. Not a single molecule in the body remains unaffected. At the same time, a new sensation appears. It feels as if each molecule is being pricked with a needle. Another sensation arises simultaneously, as if the molecules are burning or, conversely, freezing, while violently vibrating. No executioner of earlier times could have created such torment. This mechanism is new, unlike anything else. From the very beginning, every system in the human body simultaneously receives multiple contradictory impulses. For example, independently of your will, your leg makes a movement in one direction, but at the same time simultaneously it receives an opposite impulse in a direction contradicting the first. This occurs throughout the entire body, each part acting independently. Each impulse brings new, unending pain. If a person tries to move an arm, other parts of the body move instead. If a person tries to get out of bed, completely different body parts move instead of those intended by nature. This causes endless, monstrous pain that cannot be described. A person no longer understands or remembers how to walk. He does not know what to do to make his legs move. At this moment, he desperately tries to recall how to generate the correct impulse in the brain to walk. But when he tries, his body against his will produces contradictory, inappropriate movements. From the very beginning, most of the nervous system ceases to respond correctly. Over time, this process continues. The process intensifies. From the very beginning, in the area of the neck and within the neck itself, a pulling and stretching begins. At the same time, human speech is gradually destroyed. A person begins to forget what he must do, cannot think, and accordingly cannot speak. Especially at this stage, one feels that the molecules of the body are boiling and vibrating without heat, and that all these sufferings and pains are gradually approaching the brain, leaving less and less space within it. All of this gradually, in the form of a ring, seizes more and more territory, and you understand that you are dying, that you are perishing. This happened to me as well. In the final minutes of my life, my attending physician Kurapitian intervened, though, of course, not out of humane motives. I remember it lasted approximately 4 hours, perhaps more. I was dying. The doctor knew about my condition, my wardmates and orderlies had informed him, but during all that time he did nothing, although he passed through the corridor many times. Only much later did he stop at the door of our ward, stand there, look at me with an angry smile, and continue on his way the path of an executioner. More than 35 minutes passed before, on his orders, they administered an antidote to me. This time he merely wanted to teach me a lesson. Despite the antidote, I could not walk properly for a long time. Who will tell about those murdered victims of psychiatry, whose number is beyond counting? At night I would wake up to go to the toilet, since during the day I could not because of hemorrhoids that had formed as a result of torture when I had first been in the madhouse. I also could not do so because of the extreme tension. The toilet was shared, with several holes. It was entirely covered in human filth, excrement. Moreover, it was built so inconveniently that, because of its design, people would partially urinate on those sitting over the holes. The executioners, meanwhile, had their own separate toilets with locks. I would wake up and, in bitter despair, think day and night. I felt and knew that my death had come. I decided to end my life somehow, or to attempt escape. I waited. I waited until my last hope disappeared. And that hope was very slight. Ken, a former soldier of the Second World War, also woke from a bitter state, from the wounds he had received in battle. Ken would ask, "Why do frogs croak?" I did not answer. I did not answer because my heart was full of despair and bitterness. It suffocated me more powerful than death. I also did not answer immediately because if the orderlies or the so-called nurse found out that we were awake and talking, they would punish us severely. They would beat us, poison us even at night with medications and injections, thereby depriving us of any chance to rest from the torture and torment of the day. From this, a person wakes up even more exhausted and broken both in mind and body. Usually, the orderlies attack together, under the direct supervision of the so-called senior nurse and with her participation. They beat both the healthy and the sick, including those who did not even understand that they were being beaten. Once, I had the chance to see this from very close range. He was being beaten, struck again and again, yet he did not move, made no attempt to defend himself because he did not understand that he was being beaten. That time, 2 orderlies and the senior nurse took part in the beating. I still remember his eyes, the innocent eyes of an old, unfortunate man. I conserved my words, setting an example, answering in a whisper, though I could barely manage even that. Ken asked again, "Why do frogs croak?" "Because they croak," I answered, out of bitter despair and mortal sorrow, barely breathing. Ken asked again, "Why do frogs croak? Why do frogs croak? Why do frogs croak?" I knew he did not mean this literally. After some time, he fell silent, and then said, "They feel warm, they feel good, they go wherever they want." Yes, we truly envied the frogs. They were free, they could go wherever they wanted, but we could not. Yes, I envied frogs, even insects, with a kind, gentle envy. It seemed strange to me, frogs are free, and we are not frogs, yet we are worse than slaves. What kind of situation is this? What kind of unjust, lawless world? Of course, we knew what kind of world it was. We knew that this was Solzhenitsyn's Gulag archipelago. I envy frogs. Where is your cowboy head, when you believed in the enemy? Even now, I can still hear in my ears the voice of a German boy, half Russian, kind-hearted. A boy who, after an unsuccessful suicide attempt in the neighboring ward, using an aluminum or improvised cord tied to a chandelier, came into our ward a few hours later and, with difficulty, his throat had been damaged, said. "You must not offend me, I tried to kill myself today." The crude prisoners mocked him shamelessly. "Ah, my dear, my sweet one, who are you saying this to? To these sadists? To these beasts?" I wanted to say. But what was the point? At that time, I was young, trusting and, even worse, naive. It was precisely then that my false associate took advantage of this. In reality, a provocateur from the KGB, Captain Isabek Alexanyan, also known as Rajdan Gakins, a fictitious name and surname. At that time, I had no suspicion of his true intentions, and how could one suspect the leader of a secret organization and a poet? I did not suspect that he intended to have me locked away in a madhouse forever. Moreover, he had the audacity to convince my grandmother that I was insane. In short, since his initial plan to fabricate a case of military espionage against me, and even using my own hands, failed, the psychiatric option was automatically activated. I learned all of this many years later, when it was already far too late. He was an exceptionally vile scoundrel, because it is difficult not to trust a provocateur when he pretends to be a supporter of Solzhenitsyn. In the history of human rights activity, one can hardly find such a scoundrel, because his methods were extremely vile and inhuman even by KGB standards. He destroyed not only my life, but also the life of the person who replaced my mother, while my mother was still alive, and more than a mother, for parents do not give birth to children out of love for a non-existent child. On the island of death, where help from outside is especially needed, I saw many cases where parents abandoned their children, where wives abandoned their husbands, deliberately leaving them there forever. Look into my stern eyes. This feeling is familiar to everyone who has had to drink the bitter cup of suffering and death to the bottom. I would add the following lines to that song. Look into my orphaned eyes. For it is unknown whether you will ever see your loved one again. I remember when, for the first time through blackmail and provocation by that scoundrel, I ended up in the Armenian Republican Psychiatric Dispensary. My grandmother, in order to pull me out of the hands of psychiatric executioners, advised me to cry to artificially forced tears. But I could not. Whenever I tried, or even thought about it, I would involuntarily laugh inside. I laughed because my soul was filled with an icy hatred and contempt toward them, as it still is now. At the same time, I was furious with myself for yielding to the blackmail of that filthy KGB provocateur. But at that time I did not yet know that he was a provocateur, although deep down I felt that something was wrong. On the other hand, I felt very sorry for my grandmother, a miserable, defenseless, naive woman. All of this caused deep pain in my soul. From all of this, from hopelessness and despair, I laughed inwardly. Later, many years afterward, already in freedom, I understood that it is one thing to hate, but entirely another to hate in captivity, especially in a madhouse. That is why I could not cry. A completely different question is whether it would have helped me or not. It would be naive to think that a person could escape from psychiatric islands in this way. Of course, I did not think so, but the circumstances under which I was thrown into the madhouse through provocation and blackmail were entirely special. As far as I know, the KGB rarely settles accounts with people using such methods. I remember when my grandmother and I stood in front of the madhouse, at some distance from its iron doors. I could barely hold back my tears when a young girl or woman standing with other victims and their relatives at those iron doors shouted, "People, shameless people. Where is your conscience? Do you have any conscience? Look at this poor boy, have you completely lost your conscience? What are you doing? Will you really allow them to throw him to them? Where is your conscience? You are not human. I am not certain, but it seemed to me that she was speaking about me. It brought tears to my eyes. I held them back, but my eyes became slightly moist. Years have passed since then, but I still see it before my eyes as if it were happening now. An inhuman environment, hopelessness, despair, all of this gives rise to cold, fierce hatred and cold contempt. While I was in the madhouse, these feelings accompanied me constantly day and night, just as they do now. An unknown poet conveyed this truth with striking accuracy when speaking of stern eyes. Once, when people were again being beaten in front of me, I could not endure it. To watch beatings and be unable to intervene, that was not for me. These scenes tore at my nerves, destroyed me. I stood as if petrified, unable to retaliate against the executioners. So, gathering my last strength, I tried to run away from the scene, so as not to see it. What could I do unarmed and helpless? Nothing, nothing. With hatred to the point of madness, I somehow made my way back to my so-called bed and, from rage and helplessness, lay down. I lay there, filled with hatred and despair, impatiently waiting for my moment to come. My wardmate, K.N., had great endurance. He held out longer under such conditions. When he returned to the ward after such scenes, I was usually already lying down in silence. He too remained silent, but his face pale and rigid revealed his feelings. When he began to speak, his voice sounded dull and somehow solemn. Had he really fought against the Germans so that we would end up in psychiatric genocide? If he had known what would happen, would he have fought on the side of the enemy who later imprisoned him in a madhouse? In endless hopelessness, as a result of torture and torment of every kind, the victims of psychiatry gradually change more and more. They move away from human feelings, because in this inhuman environment, surrounded by constant pressure and actions against them, they gradually turn into self-programmed robots for torture and endless suffering. Over time, this process deepens. I involuntarily, in despair, observed the condition of my own brain. Day by day, I noticed how less and less space remained in the human brain for the ability to think. If this process continues for too long, it leads directly to madness. At the same time, gradually. Note, the original page contains a fragment consisting only of repeated numbers and appears corrupted or incomplete. If only one person would look at us with compassion. Each time I thought about this, I answered myself, they did not know, they did not know. You look at the world, clutching the metal mesh, the bars with your hands, and the pain in your soul suffocates you, and you cannot bear to look. You step away from the window with endless pain in your soul, seeking relief, searching for escape in other cells, knowing that there too and within all these walls there is no way out. You do not know against which wall to beat your pain. You run into new pain, realizing and understanding that freedom will not be given to you and that it does not depend on your will. The state, in the form of psychiatry, while outwardly appearing to pursue a different policy, has among its many aims another goal, to suppress not only internal prisoners, but also potential external ones, the people. What can a passerby or a visitor coming to a madhouse think? What unfolds is a reality much closer than it seems, from insult to beating. At first glance, it may seem trivial, but those who have experienced it would never call it so. These actions psychologically affect the people like a knife, creating a slave mentality, educating them. I witnessed this many times, in many forms and manifestations. From denial of visitation, to deliberate humiliation of visitors, to the use of force in front of relatives and loved ones, to the public beating of victims. I remember once standing in the visitation room with my grandmother. Other visitors were there as well. Suddenly, from a recently arrived vehicle with a red cross, noise and shouting were heard. An orderly came out and opened a large middle door. From the sounds, It was not difficult to guess what was happening. There was shouting and the threatening, filthy tone of the orderlies, and suddenly a terrible, soul-tearing scream. Then again and again many times. A girl was screaming, as desperately as her lungs allowed. The back of another orderly appeared from inside. He was dragging the girl toward the door. Her arm became visible in the grip of the orderly, but she struggled desperately and disappeared from view. Then one of the orderlies went out and opened the back door of the vehicle, but even that did not help. She continued to scream desperately. You could hear how they were beating her inside, trying to pull her out. Finally, they dragged her out. She fell onto the asphalt. The orderlies tried to lift her, but failed. Frustrated, they began beating her again. One struck her under the left side of her chest, the other under her right kidney. When they could not get her to stand, they dragged her along the ground. At the same time, they continued to beat her, though less frequently, as they were occupied with their load. They dragged her with such animal speed that her shoe flew off, which only made their task easier. And so they dragged her across the entire yard. They dragged her across almost the entire yard to the main entrance doors. And yet they could have spared themselves the effort. The vehicle could have driven right up to the doors. Usually, when a victim attempted to escape, and was caught, the orderlies, before throwing the victim into isolation, conducted what they called explanatory work. In practice, this meant beating the captured person right there on the spot, thereby giving a lesson to the others. Soviet psychiatry, in the face of the Soviet Union, destroys unknown political prisoners so effectively that the world knows almost nothing about it. Unlike prisons and camps, here it is almost impossible to live long. People arrive and perish on these psychiatric islands so quickly that they often do not even have time to learn each other's names. The isolation, artificially created by dividing victims among departments and islands, prevents them from uniting or communicating information about themselves. Unlike prisons and camps, it is forbidden in madhouses to write letters or even possess a pencil. From the very beginning, the founders of psychiatry understood that psychiatry is an ideal form for secret mass killings, because this system allows them to carry out invisible genocide and remain unrecognized, which is exactly what they do. As the West began to learn about these methods, psychiatry accordingly began to act more openly and arrogantly, intimidating and punishing its own people under the principle of blatant lies, claiming that there are no political prisoners in Soviet psychiatry. The same is happening even now, in the era of official glasnost and perestroika. More than that, Soviet psychiatry not only gains power among deputies and above, but even receives honors from the free world in the person of Yevgeny Ivanovich Chizov. As far as I know, Alfred Nobel did not include in his will any provision that executioners of psychiatry or their accomplices should also receive the Nobel Prize. For the murdered and living victims of psychiatry, this is nothing less than a resounding slap in the face both to them and to Nobel himself. I remember when Chizov was nominated as Minister of Health of the USSR, one of the deputies submitted a written question regarding abuses in psychiatry. Yevgeny Ivanovich replied that the Western Commission that had visited psychiatric hospitals had no complaints. He lied. At that time, the Commission had not yet even published its conclusions. Despite all measures taken to conceal the truth, members of the Commission still found traces evidence of crimes. For example, they discovered a psychiatric political prisoner who, as a result of torture and prolonged confinement, had gone insane, artificially turned into a madman. At the same Congress, during the Second Congress of People's Deputies of the USSR, one of the deputies, a judge by profession, proposed a bill, or amendment, as she called it, aimed at obtaining new victims for the grinding mill of Soviet psychiatry. Unfortunately, I do not remember her name. This especially stayed with me, because this crime took place openly in front of deputies and millions of television viewers, yet no one protested, and no one demanded the arrest or punishment of this criminal judge. Even though there were so-called Democrats among the deputies. As for the members of the Psychiatric Commission, it would have been better if they had not come at all, if only because, once the executioners learned of the Commission's purpose, they took measures to hide psychiatric prisoners as far away as possible. And in general, were the Commission members physicians by profession really unaware that psychiatry, through medications, can bring any normal person to such a state that no doctor in the world, especially a foreign one, can distinguish the healthy from the ill? No. Such commissions are not only unnecessary for us, they are deadly dangerous, both for us and for our fate. It is more than enough that the existence of political prisoners in psychiatry is testified to by the prisoners themselves, those on the psychiatric islands. Western psychiatry has brought us much suffering. Instead of helping us, they saved our executioners. You never know where you will gain or lose. What should one think of people who, instead of condemning criminals, if they possess even the slightest sense of conscience and honor, declaring them criminals against humanity and demanding punishment, made decisions that, for me, and I take the liberty of speaking on behalf of the murdered victims of psychiatry and many who still remain alive, sound like this. You know, colleagues, despite the fact that you continue a repressive policy, killing, tormenting, torturing, despite the fact that you have long been engaged in this, that is, in the genocide of dissenters and many others, despite the fact that you conduct experiments on victims of psychiatry, both the sick and the healthy, despite the fact that you are monsters, scoundrels, villains, and murderers, we conditionally accept you into our International Psychiatric Organization Association. For us, this was not only a resounding slap in the face and an insult, but yet another betrayal by the West. After all, we had been betrayed before more than once. I mean 1945, when former Soviet citizens were handed over by the United States and Great Britain to the Soviet Union. Live and learn. It is evident that even when they defended us for a time, and not all of us, it was only to weaken their deadly ideological enemy, the USSR. As for us, these morally bankrupt people regarded us merely as convenient material, accidentally found, and, ironically, secretly considered us underdeveloped, while they themselves lacked even a basic understanding of culture and intelligence. In our case, psychiatric political prisoners, both former and current, we physically felt this upon ourselves. And not only us, but also prisoners in camps and prisons. When politicians betray us, it is not surprising. But when a Western doctor, who has sworn the Hippocratic Oath, violates it, that is astonishing. For by committing evil, he becomes an accomplice to crime and a breaker of his oath. Those who voted for this conditional acceptance understood what they were doing, which is why, for some time, they operated behind closed doors. In these places of extermination, there is also a white, invisible death, insulin. Acting unnoticed upon cells and membranes, it silently turns its victim into an invalid. At first glance, it may seem like a harmless substance for those suffering from diabetes. But in extermination psychiatry, this is not the case at all. One of the methods of torture in psychiatry is the use of insulin. This method, like others, is used in different sequences and combinations as well as on its own. On some islands, people are first subjected to torture with sulfur and other means, and only afterward with insulin. This is not accidental, because insulin acts more strongly and in a particular way on a body already tormented by sulfur, haloperidol, belladonna, and other substances. Depending on the dose, insulin manifests externally in different ways. If the dose is large, it appears in the form of shock. If the dose is smaller and gradually increased, the person experiences it progressively. Sometimes, however, insulin's effects appear almost immediately, regardless of dosage. But these are only external manifestations, which say nothing about what is actually happening inside the human body. It is precisely this invisible effect that makes insulin so terrifying. Regardless of dosage or method of torture, the consequences for the victim are the same, tragic. It is known that the human body naturally produces insulin in the required amount. A normal organism does not need externally introduced insulin. If it is forcibly introduced, irreversible processes occur. The body loses its natural biological regulation. This is like removing the tuning mechanism from a properly functioning radio receiver or a similar system. But even more frightening is that, in our case, insulin reinforces abnormal neural connections in the body, connections that arise as a result of torture by other means. This is why psychiatry uses the seemingly harmless method so consistently. In another scenario, when executioners intend to kill their victim with insulin, the doses become higher and injections far more frequent, just like with other methods of killing in psychiatry. But there is another aspect of insulin's effect, which I discovered accidentally. It turns out that to detect its effects at low doses, one must have a sensitive wound. In my case, this was due to hemorrhoids, which developed as a result of torture with sulfur when I first entered the madhouse. I remember that at that time I was tortured so severely with sulfur that my grandmother noticed I had turned yellow. She tried to protest, but nothing came of it. At that time, I was being tortured exclusively with sulfur. Because of the hemorrhoids, when they began injecting me with insulin, I immediately noticed its effects. Each time, immediately after the injection, unbearable pain began with tremendous force, so intense that I nearly lost consciousness. Once, it seems, I actually did. And so it continued day after day except for the executioner's days off. The doses gradually increased. From these tortures, my hemorrhoids became chronic. Even on the executioner's rest days, the pain did not cease, it only slightly subsided. And I waited, in helpless fear, for the next working day of the executioners. Almost all these types and forms of poisons, despite their differences and similarities, share one common property: they block or disrupt the functioning of the brain, partially or completely. Even after the torture stops and a person is released into the general population, this inability to think often persists for a long time, depending on the type and dosage. At the same time, independently of all forms of medical torture, each poison in its own way deregulates the body, affecting human biology, as I have already said, irreversibly. The human organism can be damaged or destroyed in many ways. At first glance, some medications may appear completely harmless, but only at first glance. When they are used for torture, it becomes clear that this is not the case. One of the substances used in psychiatry is aminazine. Forcing us to take this poison daily, the destroyers of our souls would say it was to help us sleep better, to rest better. But instead of sleeping, instead of finding even a small escape from the torture and torment of the day, I would wake up even more exhausted, broken, and scattered. At the same time, I had the sensation that there was a piece of pipe in my throat, and that this pipe kept expanding. And this could not be called normal sleep in any biological sense. In the morning, it felt as though I had not slept at all, as if I had been thinking and working intensely, both mentally and physically, all night. Because of this, the sense of time was lost. Once, the senior nurse Kima, that same Stalinist, became angry and revealed herself. I remember her shouting, "Better drink it, or it will be even worse for you. If you don't drink it, I'll give you an injection which is even worse." And she carried out her threat. That very night, she gave several injections of aminazine. And then, speaking with the orderlies in a furious tone, she said, "I know it's very dangerous, but I'll give more if necessary, no matter what happens. In general, who knows, maybe he'll wake up in the morning, or maybe he won't wake up at all." And the person she injected was not even a political prisoner. Almost all methods of torture share another characteristic. Each one, in its own way, destroys the human body, neurologically and biologically, artificially turning a person into an old man, even though official records do not reflect this truth. This is one of the differences between psychiatric prisoners and other victims of the Gulag. One can take another substance, Frenanol. Once I asked a nurse what it was for. She answered that it calms the nerves very well. It is difficult to call something calming when, in reality, it disorganizes the human brain to such an extent that a person no longer recognizes himself. There were cases when a person did not understand where he was. There were cases when, after taking this drug, a person went outside and did not understand where he was, did not remember his actions although he was not mentally ill. There was a case when a political prisoner was released from the madhouse into the general zone, and on that same day went out to meet a friend who had also been released. When a bus or trolley bus passed nearby, I do not remember exactly, and a bell rang from it, a sound common in the madhouse, he immediately, automatically thought, "Why am I outside? It is quiet hour now, why is everyone outside? Where are the orderlies? I must hurry back to the ward, or the orderlies will get angry. Where are they? What is happening?" That day, he nearly got hit by a car. He was saved by a former camp prisoner, who grabbed him by the arm and pulled him away. The friend's name was Kesey. Take, for example, cyclodol. At first glance, it also appears to have a calming effect. But a person with a weak heart, after such calming, can easily die. When a person is thrown into a madhouse, no one is concerned about his health. No one cares that stress and suffering may cause a heart attack, especially in the case of political prisoners. After taking cyclodol, after a few hours, a person begins to feel heart palpitations. This is especially noticeable when lying down or when beginning to move after rest. In such moments, a person becomes like a living ram. After some time, this effect subsides, but then it returns again after a short interval, and this cycle continues for several days. When I was released the first time, I could not think because of sulfur. Everything was in a fog, I felt sluggishness. Taking advantage of this, my executioner, the KGB provocateur, immediately used it against me, attempting once again to destroy me, this time psychologically, using another method from the KGB arsenal. The scoundrel tried to ruin my life. But I survived. It required many years, and my knowledge in biology and medicine. Most importantly, one of the radio broadcasts from Deutsche Welle helped me greatly. Without it, I would not have survived. It opened my eyes to the unusual methods by which the KGB deals, in special cases, with human rights activists and dissenters. I will never forget what I had to endure. To endure what an animal feels when it is being killed to be eaten, and at the same time to witness it. To be a witness means to witness your own torment and death, to be present and do nothing, unable to defend yourself. To see, hear every movement, every word, the vile breathing of your executioner or executioners, to understand with your entire being that they have come to kill, to torture, to force poison into you or inject it, and that you cannot defend yourself. Each time you take a pill, you understand that it may drive you insane or kill you. Before swallowing it, you mentally look at the world saying goodbye to your life. These psychiatric and psychological acts are monstrous, just like the entire Soviet power system and psychiatry worldwide as a whole. They not only kill, torture, and torment, they also deprive a person of a sense of dignity. If a person tries to resist this, he is usually subjected to even greater cruelty, tortured and killed, or turned into a madman and then killed by one method or another of psychiatry. We had another reason that prevented me and others from defending ourselves: fear. Fear that for resistance we would be sent to even more terrible psychiatric islands. To avoid the worst kind of death, namely, death in the form of madness, one must choose the moment and form of one's final battle. That is why I did not resist, in order to preserve my mind for the last battle. A psychiatric prisoner, while still sane, can die only once, provided he does not make a mistake. There is another method of torture in Soviet psychiatry, and in psychiatry worldwide, which differs in essence from all others. It resembles an echo, a resonance based on conditioned reflex. After several tortures, or even after just one, depending on sensitivity, a conditioned reaction develops. It is known that if, when feeding an animal, the same music is played each time, then later, if that music is played at the usual feeding hour even without food, the animal will still feel hunger, which is confirmed by the secretion of saliva. This is a conditioned reflex. The same happens to a psychiatric prisoner every day, but in a different form. Each day, at fixed hours, executioners force a person to drink or inject so-called medications. And when, the next day, at the same hour, the tormented person sees his executioner with the loaded table of death, a conditioned reaction arises. Even before taking the poison, the person relives previous tortures and suffering. This is the first resonant echo of torture. It is not difficult to imagine how the human soul is twisted and shaken, what thoughts and feelings arise, not to mention that this next torture may be the last, unfinished one, which will either kill him or, even worse, deprive him of his reason. If a person has hypertension or heart disease, he may die even before the next torture simply from the recalled suffering triggered by this conditioned reaction. After the first echo comes the second, a consequence of the first, though sometimes independent. This forms an endless chain of nervous biological reactions. It is directly connected to the destruction of nerve cells caused by fear of the next torture, by unbearable moral and emotional humiliation at the sight of the executioner, and not only then. And nerves, as we know, are not made of iron. They cannot withstand such extreme tension and naturally perish. The third echo is both physical and psychological and in essence, eternal. Eternal, because its foundation lies in the consequences of torture and torment, which a person carries within himself like a lifelong brand. A person remembers this constantly, even in sleep, for most often in dreams he sees himself again and again in the madhouse. After sleep, this transitions into a new cycle, becoming once more a real, physical, and psychological torment in its corresponding forms. From this arises the fourth echo, the echo of psychological and psychophysiological conditioned reactions, which automatically incorporate all previous reactions, turning into a kind of cacophony. But this does not mean they are limited to these four. They are countless as the human soul and its thoughts. Sometimes psychiatry operates in the world even without madhouses. But this is something different. These are conditioned reactions in the form of mass cultural agitation. People do not notice this, because they themselves become carriers of it through their base instincts, corrupted by false values beneficial to those in power, turning the world into a madhouse. When I was dying from poisons in the madhouse, I remember thinking that it was already too late to escape in my physical condition. It was impossible. Realizing that I could do nothing, I waited for my death. And I felt ashamed before myself, before my grandmother. Ashamed that I, who had fought against the Soviet Union my entire life, since childhood, and had believed in victory, had fallen so easily into its hands without accomplishing anything I had planned. It hurt me that my grandmother, who had done everything she could to save me, who suffered because of me, who fought alongside me, would suffer even more when she learned that I had been killed, that I had died. Then I suddenly remembered that I had not yet completed my work to understand the meaning of life. Since childhood I had worked toward this in the literal, physical sense. I thought I must at least manage to think about it mentally before I died, because after death, I would no longer be able to think. In the end, reviewing everything I had done and not done, I tried to draw conclusions, but I did not have time to decide. It was also bitter that I, who all my life, from childhood, did not want to die, who worked, researched, invented, struggled with the problem of immortality, the term gerontology is inappropriate here, who dreamed of space and cosmonautics, was now dying so quietly, meaninglessly, without purpose, because I was being killed. The only comfort for me was that A.I. Solzhenitsyn knew about me. But that I had ended up here again, to my great sorrow, he did not know. One of the distinguishing features of psychiatry is the deadly intimate conversations with the psychiatrist. During any such conversation, he can calmly decide the fate of the victim and not even inform the victim of the verdict simply by pressing a button, which is what they usually do. I remember when my so-called attending physician Kurapitayan summoned me for interrogation. I immediately sensed danger, because he had already interrogated me before, and everything had already been clear the previous time. At that moment, due to recent torture, I was under the influence of poisons. My eyelids barely opened, I could hardly see, often had to use my hand to lift them, my tongue was swollen, enlarged, protruding from my mouth, it was difficult to keep it inside. But I held it in, I tried to hold it, out of pride and hatred. I could barely walk, trying to relearn how to walk but unsuccessfully. KN also tried in his own way to help me walk by more radical methods but also without success, since the poisons were still active. One of the consequences of the torture was that I began to stutter, and still do, especially when I am nervous. I walked bent forward, which reminded me mentally of an ape. Interrogations on the psychiatric islands differ from interrogations under torture in other places. Here they are more terrifying due to the specific nature of psychiatry. Psychiatric interrogation differs from ordinary interrogation in that it pursues another goal, the hope of an easy catch. They exploit the fact that the victim is already under torture and still under the influence of previous tortures. They know exactly what happens to a person in such a state, how suppressed the brain, body, and functions are. The consequences of torture and the victim's current condition create an opportunity for the executioner. Psychological pressure increases, the brain is weakened, and the victim may slip, say something incriminating, or accuse himself. Unlike other dissidents, I had fought for justice and human rights all my life in my own way, I would say through military, scientific, political means, underground. That is why the doctor knew nothing about this. The KGB provocateur, apparently, also did not know and was not directly involved in my second confinement. But this is only on the surface. If he had not placed me in a madhouse the first time, it is unlikely I would have been sent there again. Apart from agitating among youth in my early years, I entered open struggle only once, and even then not completely. This happened after the arrest of A.I. Solzhenitsyn. I sat down and wrote leaflets calling on the peoples of the world to save him. I did not manage to produce many before learning that Solzhenitsyn had been expelled. Even then I acted like a partisan, writing the leaflets by hand in block letters so that my handwriting would not be traced by the KGB. I was always cautious, or almost always. During the interrogation, I also followed the principles of covert partisan struggle. In my situation, there was no other option. The orderlies brought me into the doctor's office and soon left, taking the previous interrogation victim with them. This time, besides the doctor, there was also a buyer of slaves. At first, I thought she was from the KGB, that she had come for me. Somewhere deep inside, I even hoped she was from the KGB and would take me away from here. She was not wearing a white coat like the doctors. But I was mistaken. My doctor turned to her and said, "Perhaps this material will be suitable for your experiments, take a look." At that moment, I understood everything. This time, my doctor questioned me more roughly, in a mocking tone. Then he shifted to a harsher tone and began interrogating aggressively, often trying to ignore my answers, not allowing me to finish. He questioned me rapidly, setting traps, even attempting to answer his own questions for me, drawing politically dangerous conclusions. But I said, "No, let me speak, that's not correct." At the same time, he spoke in a malicious, mocking tone, apparently trying to humiliate me and throw me off balance. But I held on, though it was difficult because of the poisons in my body. I gathered my last strength, though I had almost none left. From the interrogation, it became clear that a denunciation had been written against me. I did not understand this immediately, though I suspected it from certain clues. At the very first interrogation, after the usual idiotic questions, he suddenly and smoothly transitioned into accusations, reading point by point from the denunciation and questioning me after each one. Later it became clear that he had not read everything the first time. He had withheld certain parts to strike later, to create a psychological blow. He had chosen the wrong person. I remained calm, using what I would call a street method of defense. But as soon as he began reading the accusations, I understood that I was finished, because the denunciation came from competent people. One of them was a lawyer. I am a non-staff KGB collaborator, she is long dead. Another was a certain Sakanush Hakabian, also from the KGB. This interrogation resembled the previous one, but now the stakes were far more dangerous. I lied according to a simple principle. I did nothing. I know nothing. This time he began. Sit down, sit down. And then it began. He started reading. He speaks about academician Sakharov, engages in conversations about Sakharov. Who is Sakharov? What do you say about Sakharov? I answered with a long, ignorant gesture of my head. Who is Sakharov? I don't know anyone by that name. Sakharov, Sakharov, whom were you speaking about? I do not know anyone by that name. Do you listen to the Voice of America? I pretended not to understand. Voice. Voice of America, do you listen on the radio? He theatrically turned an imaginary radio dial in the air. I don't know any voice. Do you listen to the Voice of America on the radio? I don't keep any voice. I don't even have a radio. Who is Sakharov? I don't know. Where are you planning to go? The denunciation stated that I intended to leave, to go away, because I could no longer endure it. It implied escape or emigration. I don't understand what you're talking about. Where are you planning to go? What is it that you can't endure anymore? I don't understand what trip you mean. They say you can't endure it anymore and plan to leave home. Where are you planning to go? I wasn't planning to go anywhere. Perhaps I was joking. They say you want to leave for another country. Perhaps I meant I was going for a walk. I was joking, just joking. Where? Which country? I don't know anything like that. I'm not going to any country. Perhaps I meant just going out for a walk. Where? Somewhere near our street, perhaps. What is it you can't endure anymore? I didn't say anything like that. Maybe I got bored at home and said I'd go for a walk. We fought desperately with our last strength. Gradually, the doctor raised his voice and began to attack more crudely and aggressively, trying to push aside my answers by ignoring them. I insisted loudly and stubbornly. Let me explain. But it came out weakly, my voice was drowned out by their conversation. Then I said louder. Let me speak, let me finish my sentence. What is he saying? The doctor asked, apparently not understanding the word sentence. He's asking to finish his sentence, the buyer doctor explained. I felt that I was losing strength, and this question was one of the most difficult. No matter how you twist or invent, even in a normal state of mind, it would be hard to find a perfectly accurate answer. And there was no time to analyze the situation. This is deliberate. One method of psychiatric interrogation is to formulate questions in such a way that until almost the very end of the question, the victim cannot understand what is actually being asked. This is done so that the victim has no time to think and prepare an answer. This is not just a psychological trap. It is a psychiatric arrest of the brain, a blockade combined with the effects of poisons. However, these methods do not always succeed, it depends on the accusation. But often they don't even bother with interrogation. Why should they? They simply assign the diagnosis required by the KGB or other authorities. In most cases, the victim's fate has already been decided. I fought for every word just to be able to finish my answer. Gradually, we all raised our voices, because they increasingly tried to ignore what I was saying. The mechanism was simple: they deliberately spoke loudly among themselves, pretending not to hear my answers. I remember that while doing this, they discussed the condition of my brain and simultaneously drew deliberately false conclusions. No matter how hard I tried, I could not shout over them. My voice had been weakened by torture. They, meanwhile, made false conclusions and answered their own questions for me, then asked for confirmation. Isn't that so? Isn't that so? No, let me speak, let me explain. My attending physician Kurapetian and the buyer of slaves attacked rapidly, especially Kurapetian, not allowing me to catch my breath. At the same time, the ability to respond quickly was reduced to almost nothing due to the poisons blocking the brain. In such a state, thinking becomes extremely difficult. Under such intense strain, the brain quickly becomes exhausted and can no longer respond rapidly and often stops functioning altogether. This depends on the dosage of substances used during torture. In such conditions, the victim is placed directly on the edge of death, on the brink of madness. Thanks to the efforts of my doctors, I found myself exactly in that state. I began to panic inwardly. I remember longing for even a few seconds to rest, to think, to find words. But they did not give me those seconds. And I could not ask them. At such a moment, it is terrifying to observe yourself from the outside, to see that your brain no longer works, that it cannot answer, that it is exhausted. And your fate, your life, depends on it. As far as I remember, I thought, this is the end. My brain could do no more. In inhuman conditions, nothing can be done. The brain refuses to function, no matter how much you urge it. It has done all it could. Now there is silence, emptiness. And time continues. They have won, I thought, and bitterness seized me. I had not expected such an end. What could I do? What could I possibly do? This is a terrible feeling when you understand that you can no longer fight, because your brain has been deliberately blocked, and they are exploiting this. But you bastards, you chose the wrong man, I thought. I had studied psychology in my youth. I gathered all my will, all remaining thoughts, and began to counterattack roughly, clumsily, as I was dying. I counterattacked while on the brink of complete mental shutdown. I knew they probably would not believe me. It cost my nerves dearly. It helped slightly that during this interrogation I managed to force the doctor to switch to Russian, placing them, especially my executioner, in a somewhat uncomfortable position. But even this did not give me time to answer. They ignored me crudely. Because of my experience and psychological training, I needed to fight in Russian. The doctor did not give up, though occasionally he stumbled for a fraction of a second. But it brought me no real advantage. In childhood, I was a very quiet boy. When the time came for military conscription, I did not want to go. I did not want to serve my enemies, violators of human rights. But at the same time, I did want to go, because I hoped to be assigned to the border troops and escape abroad. I even obtained a recommendation from a neighbor who was an intelligence officer. However, I was very quiet, very refined, educated. My grandmother said that in the army I would be killed due to hazing. So I pretended to be nervous. But I soon changed my mind when I saw the building of the Tbilisi Psychiatric Dispensary. I decided to go into the army. In Georgia, at the psychiatric dispensary, I proved brilliantly in Russian that I was healthy. Unlike my executioners in Armenia, they turned out to be remarkably decent and humane people. He says he is a scientist. What scientist? What does that mean? What kind of scientist? This was a partial quote from the denunciation. I don't understand. What scientist? Who? They say you are a scientist, the buyer doctor asked. The doctor again quoted the denunciation. Claims he is a scientist. This was a lie. I had never claimed that. Are you a scientist? He asked, more as a statement than a question. I am not a scientist. But they say so. That's strange. Judge for yourself. To become a scientist one needs education, and I didn't even finish school. This time I deceived them easily and convincingly. It did not even occur to them that one could become a scientist without formal institutions simply through knowledge. Fortunately, the denunciation did not mention that I was an inventor. That would not have been in my favor. In that case, it would have been much harder to evade, because what the KGB provocateur failed to achieve, psychiatry would have accomplished under the label of a socially dangerous type. The authors of the denunciation would have been even more upset if they had known that, for moral reasons, I never considered myself a citizen of the USSR. They say you often get up, then sit down, make strange movements, leave the room. What does this mean? Because of the last provocation by Captain Isabek Aleksenyan, also known as Rajdan Gakins, I suffered a biological injury in the shoulder area and in my right lung. As a result, I endured terrible, sometimes unbearable pain for more than 5 years. All those years, I hid it, not wanting to upset my grandmother. Modern medicine could not treat it. So it is not strange that when a person is in pain, he reacts physically. In my case, I could not show this to my grandmother. When sudden pain struck, I had to stand up, jump up, hide it, then sit down again. The pain eased somewhat through movement, what they called strange movements. I often wanted to scream, to groan from pain. But instead, I would calmly get up and go to my room, where I allowed myself to groan quietly. Sometimes the pain was so intense that I would stamp in place, not knowing what to do. Blood rushed to my face, it burned, and even exercises did not help. How could I explain this to an executioner or a buyer of slaves? To whom could I complain? I remember when the orderly brigade, together with a local police officer, broke into our home and frightened my grandmother. The policeman told me to get dressed quickly. I removed the bandage from my shoulder. I did not want them to ask about it. I could not complain to a policeman or to a brigade of executioners from the KGB. And so, sick and barely able to breathe, I ended up in the madhouse. Shortly before that, I had quit smoking. Smoking made the pain worse. But there, I could not endure it, and after a month I started again. After my release, there was a time when the pain became so intense that I thought I was dying. Then I applied one of my own ideas, a treatment method I had invented myself. I subjected the affected part of my body, my shoulder, to very strong infrared radiation, as much as I could tolerate. In this way, I partially healed myself. Later, I told my grandmother everything. During that interrogation, I answered as best I could invent. Since I don't work, naturally I need to make physical movements like exercise. I remember the buyer doctor shaking her head disapprovingly as I spoke. What does sport have to do with this? She asked. It has to do with the fact that I do physical exercises. Who is Sakharov? The doctor asked again. I don't know, I answered calmly. I could not say that I was a dissident, an anti-communist that would have been signing my own death sentence. It was at that moment that the buyer doctor said, If you are so intelligent, then why are you here? What are you doing here? I don't understand. Why are you here? I don't know. They say it is necessary for the army. She shook her head. Silence followed, more than silence. There was nothing more to say. After the interrogation, my attending physician complained to my grandmother that I was a liar, that he had never seen such a liar. I wondered what that meant. At first, under the influence of poisons, I thought it was a compliment. But gradually I understood it was not. What had he expected? Did he really think I would tell the truth to my executioner? Our life like a fleeting moment, the madhouse took it away. Avoiding the medications, refusing to take them, was almost impossible. It was not for nothing that nurses and orderlies checked every time after distributing the medications. To deceive them and not swallow the poison required skill greater than that of a professional pickpocket. This was made even more difficult by the limited options available to outsmart the enemy. The most common method was deception. To pretend to take the poison, place it in the mouth, take the cup, usually an angular plastic one, from the table, and appear to swallow. In reality, the pills were hidden in the cheek and later, when the guards left, taken out and discarded. But this method had serious dangers. The main one was that they regularly checked mouths. If deception was discovered, it led to beatings, additional poison, or both depending on how you behaved. Losing their trust meant closer surveillance during future medication distribution. And harsher treatment such as mixing powders and forcibly pouring them into the mouth. Sometimes they did this even to those who had not attempted deception, as happened to me at first. Another difficulty was that when several tablets were given at once, it was very hard to hide them in the cheek without showing fear or hesitation. Fear, delay, hesitation, all were signals of suspicion to the executioners. I personally never managed to do it successfully. It was easier to hide a single tablet if one was lucky, but fear of being caught often prevented even that. Another method, more effective but far more difficult, required strong will. After taking the poison, one had to slip away to the toilet and induce vomiting. This method was especially difficult for those with heart, lung, or stomach problems. Unfortunately, I was unable to do this. However, there were inventive people among the prisoners. One of my ward mates, H, deceived the nurse through acting. He pretended to take the pills but skillfully let them fall aside, missing his mouth. This required great dexterity so the pills would not hit the floor because the executioners were not deaf. This method was unique and could not be widely used, as it would be noticed. Later, I realized that to avoid noise, the pills should be dropped onto the bed. Nighttime was especially difficult. At 10 o'clock, the window vent was closed, though I tried to keep it open because I felt very unwell. The wards fell silent, everyone, frightened and trembling, waiting for the unwanted visit of the executioners. There was not enough air, especially cold air. That small window vent was special to me, if only because at night, after the executioners' visits, if KN managed to deceive them and not swallow the poison, or poisons, depending on how many he was given, then after they left our ward, I would get up to throw out my own unswallowed poison through the vent. KN would gesture to call me over, secretly place the pills he had removed into my hand, and ask me to throw them away. How many such evenings were there? How many? To avoid, deceive, and somehow not swallow the poison was possible only occasionally. But how can you deceive an executioner when she approaches you with a syringe in her hand? Even more terrible times came during the era of Andropov and Chernenko. Going outside seemed like a simple thing. But each time a person stepped outside, he clearly understood that he might leave but might end up in a camp, a prison, or worse, in a madhouse. In those years, one needed great willpower and endurance not to fall under the indifferent predatory gaze of the police. The number of police on the streets increased sharply. They were everywhere, hunting for so-called parasites. I remember once thinking, when meeting a policeman, that it would be more honest if one had the right to challenge him to a duel. These arrests were not even like hunting animals, unlike humans, at least have the right to defend themselves. In those years, when I went outside, I had to constantly look around. Are there police nearby? Are they driving past? Are they approaching me? Where are they standing? Where are they going? I had to avoid them at all costs because even a minor pretext could mean death in a madhouse. I remember once standing at a bus stop with my grandmother. I lost vigilance. When I came back to my senses, I saw them. They had already fixed their gaze on me, choosing their victim, especially the one sitting next to the driver. They approached slowly, reducing speed, scanning people carefully, focusing most on me. My mistake was that I was not standing still, I was casually walking around. That attracted their attention. I was waiting impatiently for transport, then became distracted and stopped. A moment more and they would have gotten out to seize me. But I made the only possible move. I snapped out of it, calmly approached the crowd where my grandmother stood, and deliberately began speaking, showing that I was not alone. That saved me. The same happened before and later as well. Once, a policeman without a vehicle took interest in me near a grocery store. Then it happened again. In those years, people were taken, right off the street, often simply based on appearance. Your appearance is suspicious, they would say. Come with me. Raids were especially common at night in cinemas. They waited for the film to end, stood at the exits, and selected whom to take. They seized people in bathhouses, cafes, barber shops, at metro entrances and exits everywhere. But home was not safe either. There was nowhere to hide from them except perhaps in the forest or in the grave. Especially hopeless was the fate of those who had previously been in psychiatric hospitals and were later released into the general population before mass arrests began. They were doomed. In the madhouse, they were awaited by torture, despair, and endlessly painful death and silence. Later, inspections and arrests began based on lists. They hunted parasites. In winter, they came to our building as well. Fortunately, I was not at home. At that time, police cars and motorcycles near residential entrances were a common sight. The country needed new prisoners. With the collapse of the USSR, the executioners of psychiatry, like others, escaped any future trial. In the event of victory by dissidents, political prisoners, or human rights defenders, they might have been judged. But instead, they were simply redistributed like part of the national wealth along with prisons, camps, the KGB, informants, and collaborators. They continued to be used for purposes completely unrelated to the ideals of human rights. This was not the society we had dreamed of. We had fought against communist fascism, but not for a soulless consumer society without purpose or light. Truth is simple. No normal person fights for a future in which his own victory leaves him worse off. We fought for something else. A human being lives to think, to create. But no one can exercise rights if the state does not provide the material conditions for a dignified life. A human is not livestock. He needs a path of light. Without it, he is a being without a dream. From this principle, everything else should be built. The highest goal of humanity is justice, full human rights. This includes everything positive that exists or should exist. Among these inseparable goals are knowledge, self-preservation, exploration of space, understanding the meaning of life, health, and even immortality. We fought to transform this country into a country of dissenters, with a new social order. But something else happened. There are things in the world that few people think about, even though the social structure of present and future humanity depends on them. No one reflects on the fact that human rights are not limited to what is written in declarations. A human being has other rights as well, fundamental, natural rights that do not require proof. A state must be built on these natural rights, a social system where there is no exploitation or humiliation of a person, and no madhouses, prisons, camps, or exile for dissenters. With the collapse of the USSR, psychiatry trembled, but it did not disappear. Despite the fact that crimes against humanity became known worldwide, for psychiatry destroyed not only citizens of the USSR, but also foreigners, it continues to operate. It continues to seek and find new victims across the former large zone. Even while changing its outward appearance, psychiatry has become even more brazen. For example, in an interview on how to identify a madman, one psychiatrist stated, "Diabetes is a consequence of psychological trauma, just like atherosclerosis, vascular sclerosis of the heart, or rheumatism. Many citizens suffer from vascular sclerosis and require treatment with us." According to this logic, People suffering from rheumatism, heart disease, or diabetes are insane and should be treated in madhouses with haloperidol, sulfur, insulin, and other means. Here are new victims even more than before. In my experience with the KGB, I always noticed that during conversations they strike simultaneously at multiple psychological targets. The same is true here. By making such statements publicly on television, the psychiatrist not only spreads falsehoods but also legitimizes them psychologically. This is done in hopes of avoiding responsibility for past, present, and future crimes. This method is called brainwashing. Of course, they never call it that themselves. Because of my helpless situation and extreme circumstances, I was forced to seek help even where it made no sense. Still, I carefully observed the staff, especially the orderlies, in hopes of escape or bribery. I studied them, looking for someone suitable. Sometimes, involuntarily, I searched for human qualities in them. But I stopped myself because I felt, almost instinctively, that there was nothing human in them. They reminded me of border guard dogs with limited intelligence, ready to tear me apart. As a rule, all staff in the madhouse were approved by the necessary authorities, meaning the KGB. If by chance someone with humane feelings appeared among them, they were pushed out. That is what happened to our nurse AS. Once, during an attempted escape, a certain patient was caught. In fact, he could hardly be considered mentally ill. He was simply hypersensitive, an allergy sufferer, and had no reason to be in a madhouse. As soon as they caught him, they immediately began beating him. One of the orderlies, GN, wore a large ring and struck the victim with it, splitting his forehead. This time, our kind nurse AS could not endure it and tried to stop them. The orderlies did not like this at all. They became even more enraged, grabbed her by the arms, cursed at her, dragged her away, and locked her in an isolation room on the lower floor while continuing to beat their victim. After that incident, they began persecuting her, calling her insane. In the end, they forced her to resign. Like a black sun, fate pursued me, destroying and avenging itself upon me. From childhood, I fought against violence and naturally became an anti-communist. Unlike many human rights defenders, I chose a different method of struggle. This method fully formed after the publication of the Gulag Archipelago, specifically its first volume. Everything had already been said. What remained was to save the world, to save ourselves. I began to fight through my scientific and technical inventions in the military field, with the goal of liberating the large zone with the help of the United States. According to my convictions, the United States was the only state whose moral foundation corresponded to mine because it was built by dissenters, for dissenters. A country that, in essence, fought for freedom for all the humiliated, oppressed, and persecuted. That is why I did everything to escape to the land of Indians, cowboys, and prairies, even though I knew it was not perfect. For example, the tragic fate of the Native Americans and the corruption brought by those who came not for freedom but for other motives. All of this was unacceptable to me then and now. I fought alone my entire life. No one helped me, and no one knew about me. In case of arrest, unlike other human rights activists, I faced certain death. I would not even have time to cry out. Later, my grandmother joined me. Risking her life, she saved my honor and my life. Risking execution alongside me, she managed with the help of an emigrant named Sacco to inform Alexander Solzhenitsyn about my fate. To die branded as insane is unbearable, an insult. At times, my grandmother performed acts of courage that few would dare in this unjust and brutal world. Others also helped save my life and honor more than once. Psychiatry kills not only with injections and pills. It can kill from a distance. That is exactly how they tried to kill me. Page 5, translation: as a result of torture with sulfur, followed by insulin, I found myself in a critical, life-threatening condition while already outside the madhouse. An urgent operation was required. For the surgeons, the procedure was extremely complex and highly risky, because the illness had developed over many years as a consequence of torture. When they learned that the condition had been artificially induced through torture, the surgeons hesitated. They needed to examine my file. Of course, that file contained much falsehood fabricated by many people, but that was not what they were looking for. They wanted to know what substances had been used on me, in what dosages, in order to determine a surgical plan. One doctor, G, called the madhouse requesting my file, even if only for an hour. The executioners refused outright. Naturally. If the file were read, it would not be difficult to understand what monstrous crime psychiatry commits. Moreover, trying both to conceal the truth and to eliminate me, they arrogantly suggested that I come to them. This was a double attempt to kill me, this time with certainty. It was the 6th year of perestroika. Killings without injections or pills did not stop outside the madhouse. Disguised under the cover of military enlistment offices, psychiatry and the KGB continued to operate at full force. It may seem unbelievable. But imagine this. You are a political prisoner. You have just been released from the madhouse after inhuman torture. Barely a month passes and a police officer arrives at your home with a summons. What would you feel? You barely survived. What remains of you can hardly be called life. And now, after destroying your youth, your health, your life, they want to take you back again, to torture you endlessly. These summonses come regularly. Who would agree to such a life? But fate does not ask whether you agree. Not everyone can endure such torture. And so it becomes clear. It is better to die in the forest, on the street, with a weapon in hand than there. Psychiatry knows exactly what a victim feels when receiving such a summons. They know how your legs weaken, how your breathing becomes heavy, how your heart pounds with fear and despair. They also know that many would prefer death to returning to the madhouse. And that is precisely what they want. If a victim cannot escape abroad or hide, there remains only one option: suicide. I too faced this bitter reality. The last time I went to the enlistment office, I went armed. If not for the intervention of a neighbor, L, and an officer, G, I would have been killed either by forced suicide or in the forest. But there is an even broader method of killing, one that claims hundreds of thousands, millions of lives. These are the illnesses acquired as a result of torture in psychiatric hospitals. This is slow death from the consequences of torture. This is hunger and cold. Because after such torture, victims are often physically incapable of working or sustaining themselves. As you see, this too is killing without syringes and without pills. Who has counted them? Where are they recorded? In which archives are these deaths documented? This is one of the deep layers among tens of millions of victims hidden by the psychiatric gulag. And not only there. Psychiatry worldwide shares responsibility. Poisons kill the same everywhere, regardless of location or justification. During certain forms of torture, water becomes the only means by which prisoners can briefly relieve their psychological suffering. In those moments, they feel human again, if only for a few seconds. But water can also be deadly. When a person is tortured with substances like sulfur, sulfazine, body temperature rises to extreme levels. At the same time, blood pressure increases dangerously. In such a state, drinking water can be fatal. Water itself becomes a weapon. There is also what one might call potassium water. The places where people drink water and smoke are located right next to the toilets, sometimes in the same room. So when you drink water, you breathe in the air of human waste, excrement and urine. And then night begins. The night of groans, fear, despair, and thirst. At night, water was deliberately turned off. It was forbidden to store water in cups or containers. So begins the desperate search for water. I usually hid water under my bed. But since they searched several times a day, They often found it. Once, I drank water from the toilet tank mechanism. That saved my life. At that time, I was being tortured mainly with sulfur. Although drinking water in that condition was dangerous, I had no choice. I had been injected again while the previous sulfur dose had not yet worn off. This was deadly. My body temperature rose so high that my blood seemed to boil. I felt as though I were burning. I needed water desperately. Drinking even a small amount was my only chance to survive. The fact that I managed to drink water was not my own merit. Another prisoner Bald L gave it to me. The water was not even meant for me. Earlier, I had noticed an engineer drawing water from the toilet tank during the day. At the time, I paid no attention. But after that night, the night of death, I remembered. That was the only time I managed to obtain water that way. Later, I could not. The orderlies had a kettle of water. But we were not allowed to drink from it. It was used only for swallowing poison. At night, it served merely as a reserve for them. But the tortures involving water did not end there. I clearly remember that after my escape from the madhouse and the subsequent provocation by that KGB scoundrel, after which I was thrown into the madhouse for the first time, I encountered the first standard method of punishment using water. At that time, I was taken into the reception area of the madhouse, a small room where they interrogate and assign their victims. They told me I had to bathe, although I was completely clean. They insisted. They were not concerned with hygiene. They had entirely different intentions. The soap was disgusting black, dirty, with a foul smell. The bathtub was just as filthy. They pushed me inside fully clothed. Then one of the executioners asked mockingly, "What, are you going to bathe in your clothes?" I immediately understood that this was a humiliation tactic and silently removed my clothes. Then someone behind me, I could not see who, turned on the hot water. For about a minute or a minute and a half, the water flowed. Just as I began to warm up, someone suddenly turned off the hot water and switched on the cold. My breath stopped, I could not breathe. Afterward, I was ill for a long time, nearly a month, from the cold. I was freezing, not knowing where to hide to warm myself. The only possible relief was a small towel, but the orderlies forbade wrapping oneself in it. I remember when I was brought in for the second time, they tried to do the same. But this time they were unlucky. There was almost no hot water, and then it stopped completely. They tried to use cold water again to strike, but there was no water at all. They became enraged. They were also angry because they failed to break my ribs, as one of the older executioners had advised. He had an old green Volga car. I remember him saying, "If I were you, I would beat him properly, break all his ribs, and throw him into isolation. Let him die there." I answered, "Try it. Do you think I won't fight back?" They were afraid of me. At that time, I could have beaten them all. Preparing to escape from the USSR, and despite the wound in my right lung, I trained even though I was seriously ill. I had no choice. But escape was difficult. There were many of them. I was alone. Psychologically, I was not ready. Physically, I had not yet been broken as much as during my second arrest. Thinking about it now, I regret deeply that I did not kill them and escape. But I cannot blame myself. The forces were unequal both at the moment of arrest and afterward. And most importantly, it was unexpected. There was no time to think. I simply did not have time. Another distinctive feature of psychiatric victims is that, unlike prisoners in camps or prisons, they receive no document confirming that they were held in a madhouse or why. Naturally, psychiatry punishes and persecutes a person for life even outside the institution. Dissenters are often confined without any court decision, making them the most rightless people in the world. Have you ever seen a completely healthy person, poisoned by psychiatric drugs, endlessly crippled by terrible pain, unable to understand his own body, unable to speak, lying on the floor of a madhouse corridor, trying to fly and failing? As he tries to fly, his body moves unevenly around its axis, then he suddenly falls onto his back, bending in that direction, not understanding what to do yet clearly realizing that he is dying, because he is in a madhouse. Ashamed, afraid to be seen in such a state, he tries to stand, to straighten himself. But again, his body makes meaningless, illogical movements. He falls again onto his side, facing the wall, moving his arms, legs, entire body without control, against his will. Eventually, he crawls toward the so-called procedure room. You have not seen this. You do not know it. And that is not surprising. The witnesses of such killings are the same victims, and they most often die there as well, on the psychiatric islands. And that person was me. And countless millions, moving toward their death. In a madhouse, a person's nerves are destroyed very quickly, especially in a healthy individual. I remember that after the very first torture, I was no longer the same. Usually, after the first torture, a nurse or doctor not directly involved in psychiatry comes to take blood for analysis. I was called as well. When she took the needle in her hand to prick my finger, my nerves could not endure it. The memory of torture flooded my mind, and I cried out in fear even before she touched me. She looked at me in surprise. What could I say? I could not tell her the truth, though I desperately wanted to. As victims approach death or insanity, they begin to feel especially strongly the helplessness of their situation. Often, death and madness come together. You do not know which will reach you first. And you watch, with fear and despair, as your mind gradually fades. Your brain, against your will, becomes a robot. Your emotions and feelings are suppressed. The human psyche perceives and feels this irreversible transformation into something unfamiliar. The mind itself becomes different without emotion, without reflection, simply observing. Then something else begins. When a person tries to think, to analyze something, the brain encounters a barrier. At first, it seems like simple fatigue. But over time, this barrier grows stronger, more frequent, more complex. It develops into traps leading to physical sensations and behavioral changes. The victim is aware of all of this. Because of the growing difficulty in thinking, as the person turns into a robot, he is drawn deeper and deeper into this state. He looks at the surrounding world with despair, feeling that he no longer belongs to it. He falls into panic calmly, if such a thing can be imagined, realizing that he can no longer think when he wants, cannot control his thoughts, cannot even solve the simplest mental tasks. Internally, this process appears strange and frightening. But the victim is no longer capable of reacting with the same fear as before. He has already become, biologically, a kind of robot with suppressed emotions. Over time, something even more disturbing occurs. When trying to think or set a mental task, the brain suddenly encounters a deeper vacuum, one that had not been perceived before. This barrier feels physically and psychologically more painful than the previous one. When the brain hits this barrier, the thinking process breaks abruptly. No matter what you try to do, the brain refuses to function, as if trapped in an informational vacuum. The victim falls into confusion and panic. Naturally, he tries to understand what is happening to regain control. He attempts to analyze his own mind, to observe it from the outside. But this only deepens the collapse. The more he tries to think, the deeper he sinks into the mental void. There is no way out. The only temporary escape is to stop thinking about the problem entirely. Only then does the brain slowly, weakly, partially regain its ability to function. The longer and more systematically a person has been subjected to torture, the deeper this process becomes. The victim approaches madness with absolute inevitability. He understands that he can do nothing. It is no longer within his power to restore his mind. Another terrible feature of this form of death is that the victim becomes a witness to his own destruction. He observes everything with forced indifference. Not only because he is at the limit but because the treatment cannot be stopped. He is not free. From the moment the victim first encounters this barrier, artificial madness and death begin to advance toward him rapidly without pause, day or night. When I was taken to the madhouse for the second time, they took me straight from my bed. The orderlies were in civilian clothes. A district police officer personally escorted me in his own car. They were afraid. At first, naively, I thought they were from the KGB and that I was being taken there. I assumed it was because of my secret letter to people in the West. Perhaps it had been intercepted, or perhaps the messenger had betrayed me. Most likely, the letter never reached its destination, or they did not believe it. Otherwise, I might have been saved before the executioners came for me. But on the way, I realized my mistake. I remember that after helping KN, his legs hurt from rheumatism that day, and lying down on my bed, if it can even be called that, I overheard a conversation. Before I arrived, another man had been lying in my place. Just an hour and a half earlier, he had committed suicide. The bedding, mattress, blanket, everything, even the floor, had been covered in blood. Fortunately, before I arrived, they had replaced the linens and washed the floor. I heard the same later in the procedure room from a conversation between an orderly, S, and a nurse. The orderly referred to it as a job. But in my condition, none of this mattered. I was waiting for my death. I did not even look at the bed. I was preparing with difficulty for my final battle. My only desire was for it to happen as quickly as possible. I was in a hurry to die. But something still held me. A sense of duty to my homeland which I had never seen. I mean the land of Indians, cowboys, and prairies, the United States. As I have said, for me the United States was always the homeland of dissenters, of those who seek freedom, who fight not only for themselves but for others. That is why I held on as long as I could. There were other reasons as well. Since I fought tyranny through military scientific means, through my inventions intended to help protect the United States from communist oppression, I had to endure until the last moment. I had to survive long enough to pass this knowledge on. The mechanics of death and the replenishment of the wards with new victims were simple to the point of madness, and far worse than in war. Because, unlike soldiers, victims of psychiatry are not allowed to resist their enemies. The wards of the murdered were immediately filled with new, pre-selected victims. And the victims, often did not even suspect anything until the executioners came for them. But the society of planet Earth does not care. The list of those killed will hardly be found in KGB archives. When dissenters are sent to madhouses for a agonizing death, no official document is filled out stating that a person is being sent there for dissent. As for the archives of Radio Liberty, they contain only those who managed to cry out or for whom others cried out. The deeper layer of victims lies far below in the abyss. They could not cry out. They were alone in their struggle for freedom. And it is also true that in the early years of Bolshevik rule, the free world did not truly concern itself with the freedom of dissenters. Dissenters felt help only during the Cold War, and even then, not consistently. Speaking of justice, compassion, kindness, and therefore true humanity, it would be unjust not to mention those individuals and countries whose actions played a decisive role in sending people to madhouses, prisons, and camps. I mean the extradition of political refugees regardless of how they escaped, by sea, land, or even by hijacking an airplane. For a truly human being, another's pain does not exist. All pain is shared. But that applies to truly humane nations. Where are they? Any country that extradites a political refugee becomes an accomplice in murder, whether through psychiatry, prisons, or camps, most often through psychiatry. Days passed in torment, fear, and hopelessness. People in our department became increasingly suppressed, withdrawn, and tense. In the upper ward, Another person committed suicide. He hanged himself in the toilet. His nerves and soul could not endure it. Around the same time, a woman in the female ward was killed, although rumors said she committed suicide. Officially, the very fact of her death was concealed. Later, they claimed she died of illness. But we knew the truth. Before her death, she had been severely beaten several times while lying in bed. I knew that if I fell, I would crash and die. What I feared most was that I might not die completely and that they would put me back into the madhouse again. I had to either win or die. I wanted to escape, because I cannot endure lack of freedom. Captivity is not for me. To escape, I needed them not to notice my absence for some time. But I was afraid, because escape was complicated by the fact that at night, together with the duty doctor, they counted us. And most importantly, we were dressed in psychiatric rags. In such clothing, it was almost impossible to escape during the day. So-called citizens would immediately notice and report us. Not to mention the police, who actively hunted escaped patients. So there was only one option. To wait for night and jump from a height, trying to reduce the fall distance slightly by gripping the lower part of the window frame with my hands. I understood that my chances of survival were almost non-existent. Still, I hoped that during the fall I might be able to catch onto a small concrete ledge below the window and thus slow my fall, even if only slightly. Another option was to jump onto a concrete slab that served as the roof of the rear entrance. I hoped to jump at an angle rather than straight down, but it was too far. The first option seemed simpler. To climb out the window and then see what happens. Making a rope from bed sheets was impossible. In our ward, 2 out of 4, or at least one, was definitely an informer. He would have reported me. I knew I had almost no chance to survive. But I decided. Because, such a death was better for me than remaining in a madhouse. But the escape failed. At that time, KN, apparently, noticed that I was loosening the nails in the window. One night, pretending to speak casually, he began telling a story about someone who escaped through a window either using a rope made from sheets or by clinging to the wall. In truth, it was almost impossible to hold on, but that was not the point. At that time, I knew he was a supporter of Alexander Solzhenitsyn. He admitted this much later, not to me, but to my grandmother. I remember once, in the evening, when I was dying, he said that these inhuman sufferings were not new, that these tortures were not new, that Solzhenitsyn had already written about all of this. My grandmother then asked, "How do you know about Solzhenitsyn?" He replied, "And how do you know about him?" In that moment, my grandmother revealed herself. But that happened much later. At that time, like all psychiatric prisoners, I did not trust anyone. I did not know whether he was truly one of us. Later, other events occurred, giving new chances for escape. At the same time, there remained a faint hope of release. But that was not the point. After torture, I had become extremely weak. More than anything, I simply waited to find out whether they would release me or not, so I could escape and end my life, or simply end it. I searched, choosing a method of battle against the personnel of the madhouse, in the sense of resistance and suicide. To kill myself was not so simple. In a madhouse, sharp objects were prohibited. Wire from a spring did not suit me either. It would only prolong suffering and, most importantly, gave no chance to kill at least one executioner before killing myself. I should note, if all victims of psychiatry, prisons, and camps had killed at least one executioner before taking their own lives, it would have forced them to fear us. In the end, I became so weakened by torture that without a good sharp knife, I could hardly have killed anyone before killing myself. And yet, that was exactly what I intended to do, to take as many executioners as possible with me into death. Sharp objects were forbidden not to prevent suicide but to prevent victims from killing their executioners, doctors, orderlies, and all the rest. But I had another option. It was unreliable but still an option. Each time my grandmother came bribing guards and orderlies, she brought me food. Sometimes she also managed to bring a fork or knife. I planned to use one of these to end my life. Each time, I had to decide. End my life now or wait. The world, with its immoral society, immoral laws, and rulers, will never judge or sentence them. It lacks conscience and honor. But I am not the world. I am myself. And although I have no army, I have dignity, honor, and conscience. And so, in the name of my conscience, in the name of the murdered and living victims, I sentence all executioners to death. I have said everything. Appeal, how to live. What should be done? Justice, equality, truth. All those who needed them sought them. Each sought in his own way, bringing light and warmth into human souls. Many fought, sparing neither themselves nor their lives, and died in unequal struggle. But this was not in vain. Their heroism helped others. The world knows such figures as Robin Hood, Yemlian Pugachiev, and the human rights defenders of the USSR. All of them sought justice, equality, respect for human rights, and happiness for all. But they were denied this. More than that, for these aspirations, they were labeled bandits, thieves, and later during the USSR mentally ill, CIA spies, traitors, criminals, parasites. A distant relative of mine, my grandmother's grandfather's brother, Haji Ingo, was also considered a bandit. He robbed and distributed what he took to the poor. As far as is known, he was never caught. At that time as now, if they had caught him, the laws of the world would have been against him. Which only proves laws serve their own interests, not yours. Which proves that laws are written for their benefit, for their interests, and against yours, including, of course, mine. In other words, they simply removed your socio-economic and political rights so that your true, natural, full human rights would not remove them. The creators of those systems, along with their socio-economic and political interests, which do not correspond to genuine human rights. That is why you do not know these rights, even though they exist, both for you and for me personally. The rights you currently have are called basic human rights. But in reality, in order to meaningfully exercise even those limited rights, one needs the full set of rights, the ones that were excluded and replaced with false ones in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. That is the whole point. The authors of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, apparently, did not understand that true human rights possess properties similar to the periodic table. Because of this, they did not suspect that sooner or later their falsification would be exposed. And I have managed to do that. For example, every person has the right to curiosity. This is natural and needs no proof. From this follows that every person has the right to knowledge, and therefore the right to free education, including free higher education. As you can see, full human rights are not just rights, they are also guiding principles. They indicate what must be done. Another example. Every person has the right to life. From this follows that every person has the right to free medical care. Because if one has the right to live, one must also have the means to preserve life. From this also follows that, since the state must ensure and protect human rights, systems such as education and healthcare must be state-supported. Similarly, the right to life also derives from the right to safety. This implies the necessity of having an army and law enforcement institutions to protect these rights. As you can see, full human rights do not correspond to the existing declaration. Another example. Every person has the right to property. But this alone is incomplete. According to full human rights, a person has the right to property and to dispose of it, but not in a way that violates the rights of others, such as through exploitation, humiliation, or harm. The absence of such provisions is not accidental. It is a deliberate distortion of human rights. In other words, true socio-economic equality is equally inconvenient for both communism and capitalism. Because if full human rights were implemented, both systems would lose their unjust advantages. Full human rights not only define rights, they demonstrate and justify them. For example, if a state refuses to provide medical treatment, it becomes along with its doctors an executioner. Or, if a person has no home and cannot afford one, and the state refuses to provide housing, it violates the right to life and a dignified existence. Because it is obvious that a homeless person will freeze and die. In the USSR, this was often done especially to former political prisoners. They were stripped of registration, deprived of housing, and released into society as homeless individuals. Even today, despite the collapse of the USSR, such practices still exist. The consistent logic of full human rights clearly defines the obligations of a rights-based state. For example, to ensure the right to education, such a state must publish scientific, technical, and educational materials. From this follows that the state must have its own publishing system. Dear inhabitants of planet Earth, full human rights do not exist anywhere on Earth. Only the Declaration of Basic Human Rights exists, and even that, not everywhere. The mistake of all seekers of truth and justice was that they tried to invent social and economic systems based only on partial human rights without understanding how incompatible this approach is. True human rights, natural, complete rights, are not merely a list of rights. They are a logically self-developing system, like the periodic table. Full human rights themselves indicate what must be done to live freely and justly. But freedom does not mean the right to violate the rights of others. Such violation is itself a crime against human rights. Full human rights possess an internal, self-protecting logic. Because of this, they reject all evil and falsehood. All that remains is to follow them. On freedom of speech and press, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights proclaims freedom of speech and press. But it does not explain how to implement it in practice. This is because the essential continuation of that principle was removed. In reality, if you try to exercise your freedom of speech, for example, on television, radio, or other media, it does not mean you will be allowed to do so. Why? Because media outlets are owned either by the state or by private individuals. And they are not obligated to give you access. You can buy access, for example, by paying for publication. But that is not freedom, it is another form of intellectual servitude. Thus, in reality, very little remains of your supposed freedom. At best, you can organize protests or use underground publishing methods. True human rights, however, require something else. Since state power exists to protect human rights, it must provide public media platforms. These platforms must give citizens equal and free access to express their views. Furthermore, to protect culture and health, such media must not broadcast advertisements. Advertising harms human consciousness, distorts perception, and acts as a form of brainwashing. On workers, regardless of the social or political system, workers' rights are violated everywhere. Every day, after exhausting labor, a worker returns home drained, detached from intellectual life. He repeats the cycle until retirement and soon after, death. Is this what a human being is born for? During the USSR, even intellectuals who were dismissed from their positions were forced into manual labor. After a few months, their mental capacity deteriorated due to exhaustion. This proves that such treatment violates human rights, specifically, the right to think and the right to health. There are also other forms of violation. Exploitation, state or private, discrimination and humiliation, social inequality based on income, profession, or status. This hidden moral conflict exists everywhere. It stems from false values imposed by social systems. Through media, advertising, and culture, these values are repeated constantly. Over time, people, especially children, begin to accept them as normal. This process is called brainwashing. And it is precisely these distorted values that generate crime. Full human rights, grounded in justice, expose these distortions and show the correct path. Workers in different countries, realizing that both capitalism and communism are unjust systems, despite being opposites, began to explore another idea: shared ownership of factories. In such systems, factories belong to the workers, employees, and specialists who work in them. In this case, there is no capitalist exploiter, nor a party-controlled exploiter. Workers themselves become owners, but only in terms of property, not in terms of exploiting others. However, to implement this globally would require enormous financial resources, essentially borrowing money to buy back all production systems. But this is absurd, buying the right to work for oneself. Here it becomes clear. The real obstacle is not only laws, but the entire socio-economic structure, which contradicts full human rights. Therefore, these systems must be changed. Dear inhabitants of planet Earth, those in power will never agree to such changes voluntarily. It would strip them of their ability to dominate and exploit. But full human rights exist precisely to be realized if the will exists. On peasants in many countries, a shameful phenomenon still exists: bonded or dependent labor, akin to servitude. Sometimes this is disguised under different names such as agricultural labor. But regardless of terminology, it is a violation of human rights. A peasant, due to poverty and inequality, is forced into near slavery conditions. This violates the right to dignity, the right to equality, the right to a dignified life. According to full human rights, every person has the right to land because one cannot live on air. However, this raises practical issues. Overpopulation, land scarcity, and the need to regulate population growth. A person should only own as much land as they can cultivate without exploiting others. Otherwise, it becomes a violation of human rights. Furthermore, agricultural land should not be freely sold. If sold, it may be used for non-agricultural purposes, threatening food security. Therefore, land should be allocated freely for productive use. If a person cannot or does not wish to cultivate it, it should return to the state and be reassigned. This ensures food supply and fulfills the state's responsibility to protect human rights. However, owning land is not enough. To farm effectively, one needs equipment, seeds, fuel, and other resources. Under capitalism, this usually requires loans, which leads to debt. Debt, in turn, can lead to loss of property or even imprisonment. This creates a form of economic slavery. Meanwhile, bankers face no such risks. Their income continues regardless of others' hardship. This inequality is a clear violation of human rights. Dear reader, here we encounter the same situation as with shared ownership of factories. People are forced to take loans in order to buy their own rights, the right to work. This makes it clear that existing systems are deeply hostile to human beings and contradict full human rights. According to the logic of full human rights, there remains only one conclusion. Since every person has the right to life, the right not to suffer from hunger, the right to equality, and the right to a dignified existence, the state is obligated to ensure these rights. Unlike Marxism, Leninism, a transition to a state-regulated system does not mean a total ban on private enterprise. Full human rights regulate it. In other words, every person has the right to entrepreneurship, but only if it does not violate the rights of others. This means that a person may engage in private enterprise only if they work alone without exploiting others. Group enterprise is also possible, but only on equal terms among participants. No one has the right to dominate or exploit another. It is also clear that a private entrepreneur may engage in business only if the material goods are produced by their own labor or by a group working on equal terms. It is crucial to understand. Full human rights do not tolerate half measures. They cannot coexist with other socio-economic systems, because they form their own complete system. As I have said, full human rights are based on justice. Justice itself is a natural, self-evident human right. Therefore, The only legitimate state is one that protects full human rights. In such a state, no party or organization has the right to violate these rights. A human being is not a toy, not something to be manipulated, subjected to genocide, reduced to poverty, or forced into begging or crime. No. Full human rights exist precisely to prevent such outcomes. A rights-based global system must not only protect these rights but also defend them against any organization or party whose goals contradict them. If a government deliberately violates full human rights, then the people have not only the right but the duty to overthrow such a government by force and establish a new one. Because a human being is born with a free mind and therefore with the right to defend that freedom. The duty to fight arises only when one's own or others' full human rights are violated. And in a cosmic sense, just as on Earth, only when the full rights of other intelligent beings are violated, including extraterrestrial beings. As you can see, everything in full human rights is interconnected. They arise from the very logic of positive, complete human rights which point the way forward. This is precisely what I call, according to this logic, a bright future. There is no alternative. So, dear inhabitants of planet Earth, let us begin to act before it becomes too late to act at all. At least have pity on yourselves. What kind of meaningless, hopeless, unhappy lives are you living? Are you truly happy? Epilogue: a personal letter to my unknown comrades. Because of unjust laws regarding the rehabilitation of former political prisoners of psychiatry, I am still forced to remain underground. Based on full human rights and the right to defend my dignity, I have secretly created my own military political organization to defend my rights, my honor, and the honor of my grandmother. I hope for your support. For now, we are only two, myself and my grandmother. But that does not matter. What matters is the goal. Figuratively speaking, this may be my last chance. I believe that hostile forces will destroy us. But that is not important. What matters is that my grandmother and I fulfill our duty to our souls and to humanity to the very end. I think this letter may become a farewell letter. I could say much more. For example, how instead of gratitude for our voluntary devotion to the people of the former large zone and to the people of the United States, the U.S. government, or rather, high-ranking military officials, the Senate, the CIA, and the FBI, ignored my appeals and abandoned us to our fate. I could tell you how, after the collapse of the USSR, we were dying from cold, hunger, and poverty, and I, in addition, from my old injuries caused by psychiatry. But I will say something else. I have placed in your hands a weapon that leads to victory. But remember, strength lies in unity and purity of thought. The easiest form of struggle for full human rights is legal struggle wherever it is possible. I ask you, do not be as naive as I was in my childhood and youth. Naivete can destroy you and those you love just as it almost destroyed me, because of my impulsiveness, naivete, and inexperience. I do not say goodbye to you. Because whether alive or dead we are still with you. Handwritten notes on the original page. Likely contact details. Republic of Armenia, City of Yerevan, 375,096 Norkis, 2nd District, Monoban Street, Building 851112, Apt 46 Agobalan Elon, Midrasen, name as written, may require verification due to handwriting.